My name is Natalia Campbell. I am 34 years old, and today a judge ordered me to remove my Distinguished Service Cross in a crowded courtroom. My mother-in-law smirked, thinking she had finally stolen my home and destroyed my life. I said nothing and calmly unpinned my medal. What she did not know was that my next move would end the judge's career and send her straight to federal prison. Before I continue this story, let me know your age in the comments below, and welcome to the Pana Vengeance channel. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who thought they could walk all over you. The descent into this nightmare started precisely on Christmas Eve. I had spent the entire morning preparing a holiday roast in the kitchen of my secluded Vermont timber frame estate. The property, valued at $2.5 million, was left to me by my late Army Intelligence Commanding Officer. It featured vaulted ceilings, reclaimed wood beams, and 50 snow-covered acres that felt like an impenetrable sanctuary. He left it to me because he understood the toll of our work. We spent years deciphering hostile foreign chatter in combat zones, and he knew I needed a quiet fortress to decompress. My husband Julian and his mother Beatrice never understood that need. Beatrice is a woman obsessed with projecting the illusion of New England old money. She wears vintage pearls to breakfast and treats basic kindness like a character flaw. Julian was her shadow, a man drowning in undisclosed corporate debt, who masked his constant failures behind custom-tailored suits. I invited them over for the holiday, foolishly hoping the warmth of the season might thaw the freezing tension that had been growing between us for months. I had just placed the roasted tenderloin on the center of the dining table. The scent of rosemary, garlic, and crackling birchwood filled the room. Julian stood near the stone hearth. He traced the handle of a heavy, antique iron fireplace poker, refusing to meet my gaze. The silence in the room felt entirely wrong, lacking the usual holiday cheer. Beatrice sat at the head of the table, sipping her spiced wine with practiced, icy elegance. She watched my every move like a hawk, calculating the perfect moment to strike. Before I could even slice the meat, Beatrice reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a thick manila folder and dropped it directly onto my porcelain dinner plate. The thud rattled the expensive silverware. A splash of dark red wine spilled across the pristine white linen tablecloth. I looked down at the documents spilling from the folder. The top page displayed a psychiatric evaluation detailing severe combat trauma signed by a local doctor I had never met in my entire life. Beneath it lay a quitclaim deed transferring full ownership of my estate to the Sterling Family Trust. "Hand over your biometric YubiKey," Natalia, Beatrice said, her tone as brittle as the winter air outside. She pointed a manicured finger at the hardware security token clipped to my belt. "You are unwell. Your paranoid tendencies are escalating. We are simply stepping in to manage your assets before your mind deteriorates further. Sign the deed hand over the key, and we will ensure you receive the residential care you so desperately require." I shifted my focus to my husband. Julian examined the floorboards, his jaw clenched tight. He chose silence while his mother attempted to extort his wife and steal her sanctuary. His cowardice burned worse than her arrogance. A fragile target might have wept at the betrayal. A lesser woman might have screamed. I did neither. Years spent dismantling cyber-terrorism networks had trained me to view emotional manipulation as a tactical vulnerability. I picked up the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. I grasped the thick cardstock with both hands and tore the documents cleanly down the center. The ripping sound was sharp and definitive. I dropped the shredded halves right into her wineglass. "Dinner is over," I stated, keeping my voice at a low, surgical calm. "Get out of my house." Julian finally looked up, his face pale. "Natalia, wait," he stammered. I stepped toward him, my posture rigid. "I said out." I reached beneath the edge of the dining table and pressed a hidden security panel. Heavy steel storm shutters engaged over the exterior windows with a low mechanical hum, sealing the estate tight. The biometric deadbolt cycled, locking down the perimeter. Beatrice stood up her chair, scraping harshly against the wood floor. The patrician mask slipped, revealing the desperate predator beneath. She snatched her wool coat from the entryway, pulling the collar tight against her neck. "You will regret this," she sneered, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "By tomorrow morning, I will have the local courts drag you out of this cabin in a straitjacket." She stepped out into the freezing night, Julian trailing closely behind her without a single word of defense. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the sudden quiet. The threat hung in the chill air, but Beatrice had made a fatal miscalculation. She believed she was evicting a broken soldier. She had no idea she had just declared war on a digital apex predator. My internal body clock woke me at 0500 hours. The Vermont winter morning was painfully bright sunlight reflecting off the fresh snowdrifts pressing against my steel storm shutters. I brewed a pot of black coffee, the bitter aroma filling the kitchen as the floorboards creaked under my bare feet. I expected a quiet holiday morning to strategize my divorce proceedings and secure my property rights. Instead, the tactical alert system mounted above my kitchen island began to flash a steady, urgent crimson. I set my ceramic mug down on the granite countertop. The sharp click echoed in the empty room. I walked down the hall to my secure server room, placing my thumb on the biometric scanner to unlock the reinforced door. A wall of monitors illuminated the dark space in a cold blue glow. My network diagnostic tools were redlining. It was not a localized breach attempt on my router. It was a targeted digital saturation campaign centered around my name, my military record, and my civilian consulting firm. I opened the primary social media aggregator, and Beatrice Sterling filled the center screen. She sat on a plush velvet sofa in her opulent living room, wearing a muted cashmere sweater. Her posture was perfectly engineered to project fragile devastation. Julian stood right behind her, acting as a silent, tragic prop. He wore his custom Italian suit, gazing down at the floor, refusing to look directly into the camera lens. Beatrice held a tissue to her eyes, though her cheeks remained dry. "I never wanted to make this public," Beatrice whispered to the camera, her voice trembling with practiced precision. "But our family is terrified. My daughter-in-law Natalia is a combat veteran. We are so proud of her service. But last night she suffered a severe psychotic break. She locked us out of our own family gathering in the freezing snow. She possesses elite military training and refuses to seek psychiatric help. I am begging the community to pray for her and asking the authorities to intervene before she hurts someone." Beatrice then held up a printed photograph of me in my Army dress uniform. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the Distinguished Service Cross pinned to my chest. "This medal," she sighed softly, "represents unimaginable trauma. Trauma she brings into our home. We are living in fear." My jaw tightened. That medal was awarded after my intelligence unit was ambushed in a hostile foreign territory. I had maintained our encrypted communications grid while taking enemy fire, coordinating an extraction that saved 14 soldiers. It represented discipline under extreme duress. The air in that desert had tasted like copper and smoke. Beatrice was twisting my highest honor into a symptom of mental defect. She was painting a target on my back, orchestrating a digital lynch mob from the comfort of her heated mansion. The metrics scrolling down my secondary screen were staggering. Millions of views, thousands of comments demanding I be stripped of my security clearances, calling for my immediate institutionalization. The real-world consequences materialized 3 minutes later. My encrypted email client chimed in rapid succession. A message arrived from my primary civilian contractor, a prominent financial institution in Boston. The subject line read, "Immediate suspension of consulting services." The body of the text was cold corporate jargon, citing a breach of their public morality clause. 2 more emails followed from separate tech firms. $250,000 in projected annual revenue evaporated in under an hour. Beatrice had severed my income streams with a single orchestrated lie. She aimed to isolate me, drain my resources, and force me to hand over the biometric YubiKey to this estate just to survive. Most people would crumble under that kind of coordinated pressure. They would issue a frantic public denial or call a crisis management lawyer to beg for mercy. But panic is a civilian luxury. In Army intelligence, when the enemy telegraphs their strategy, you exploit their supply lines. Beatrice believed she was dealing with a shattered soldier. She forgot she had invited a cyber forensics investigator to dissect her digital footprint. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and cracked my knuckles. I isolated the primary video link and ran a packet sniffer to trace the engagement origins. I watched the geographic data populate across my terminal. The thousands of shares, likes, and outraged comments were not originating from concerned citizens in Vermont or Boston. They were pinging back in dense simultaneous clusters from server farms in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. It was a textbook artificial engagement farm. Beatrice had not just posted a video, she had purchased a highly sophisticated bot network to force the algorithm to push her lies to the top of the trending feeds. I initiated a deep dive trace on the purchasing accounts tied to those bot farms. Her boutique PR firm hid behind layers of privacy protections, but those walls were built to stop casual snoops, not a military-trained cyber warfare specialist. I bypassed the first 2 proxy servers using a reverse tunneling script I wrote during my deployment. Lines of green code cascaded down my terminal. Within 12 minutes, I breached the payment gateway. The digital receipts were funded by a shell company named Sterling Holdings, LLC. My mother-in-law had paid $50,000 to manufacture a public crisis. The sheer desperation of her maneuver clarified the battlefield. You do not spend $50,000 to steal a house unless you are hiding a much larger debt. She was trying to starve me out, but she had merely handed me the exact thread needed to unravel her entire facade. She was playing a petty game of social checkers. I was initializing asymmetric cyber warfare. I began archiving the wire transfers, compiling an airtight dossier of her digital fraud to prepare for my next strike. I reached for my coffee mug, intending to dig deeper into the Sterling Holdings corporate structure. Before my fingers touched the ceramic, a sharp, piercing siren shattered the quiet of my home. My exterior perimeter alarms tripped, sending a jarring, high-pitched tone echoing through the timber beams. I shifted my gaze to the external security feeds. The monitor displayed the heavy iron gates at the base of my driveway. Red and blue emergency lights sliced through the falling snow. 2 heavily armed local county deputies were out of their cruisers, utilizing heavy steel bolt cutters to breach my private gate. Beatrice had promised to weaponize the courts, and her personal executioners had just arrived at my doorstep. The metallic snap of heavy steel bolt cutters echoed through the crisp Vermont air, transmitted clearly through my perimeter audio feeds. I stood in the center of my kitchen, a steaming mug of black coffee cooling on the granite island, and watched the high-definition monitor. The heavy iron chain securing my driveway fell away, sinking into the fresh powder. 2 county cruisers pushed through the breached gate, their tires spinning briefly on the ice before gripping the asphalt. The flashing blue and red strobes painted the pristine white landscape in harsh, erratic colors, disrupting the quiet sanctity of my timber frame estate. They parked at chaotic angles across my front lawn, tearing up the dormant grass beneath the frost. 2 deputies stepped out of the idling vehicles, their breath pluming in the freezing morning air. Their hands rested habitually on their duty belts, unfastening the safety retention straps on their holsters. They were preparing for an altercation. I did not scramble to hide hard drives. I did not rush to shred documents. The rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway provided a steady counterpoint to the heavy boots stomping up my front steps. The thick wood of my home absorbed the brunt of their fists pounding against the reinforced oak front door. "Open up, County Sheriff's Department," a gruff voice barked the sound, muffled by the thick insulation. I secured my primary terminal with a localized encryption sequence, ensuring my offshore routing protocols remained invisible, and walked unhurriedly down the corridor. The polished hardwood felt cold beneath my bare feet, grounding me in the present moment. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door inward. The bitter winter wind rushed into the foyer, bringing the sharp scent of pine needles and raw exhaust fumes from their cruisers. The taller deputy, his brass nameplate reading Hayes, did not bother with pleasantries or procedural introductions. He shoved a folded piece of paper toward my chest, his face twisted into a scowl. "We are executing a search and seizure warrant for all electronic devices, servers, and digital storage hardware on these premises," Hayes declared. I did not take the paper from his hand. I simply leaned forward, my eyes scanning the legal jargon printed on the page. The document was an overly broad fishing expedition, entirely lacking the specific probable cause required for digital forensics. It was a blank check to strip my home of its technology, but the signature at the bottom corner stood out in stark black ink: Judge Harrison Croft. The man was a permanent fixture at the Sterling family's private country club galas. He was frequently photographed sipping expensive scotch with Beatrice on the veranda, trading local influence for high society access. The local justice system was operating as a private retrieval service for my mother-in-law. This warrant lacks the constitutional requirements for a digital seizure, I stated, keeping my tone entirely conversational. You do not have jurisdiction to unplug my hardware. Hayes sneered, stepping hard into my foyer and forcing me to take a step back to avoid a physical collision. His partner followed close behind, tracking melting snow and mud across my reclaimed wood floors. "You can argue with Judge Croft down at the station," Hayes said, his hand dropping to the heavy tactical flashlight on his belt. "Right now, you are going to point us to the server room, or I will charge you with obstructing a law enforcement operation and tear this cabin apart looking for it myself." I analyzed their body language. Elevated heart rates, dilated pupils, rigid postures. They expected a terrified civilian. They expected me to weep or panic under the weight of their authority. "Follow me," I instructed, turning my back on two armed men. I guided them down the main corridor. We reached the reinforced steel door of my command center. I punched my 12-digit passcode into the wall-mounted keypad. The heavy locking mechanisms disengaged with a solid mechanical thud. I pushed the door open, revealing the dual commercial-grade server racks, the tangle of fiber optic cabling, and the low, steady hum of industrial cooling units. Hayes and his partners stepped inside, their eyes scanning the blinking LED indicators on the hardware. The sheer scale of the setup clearly unnerved them, but Hayes recovered quickly. "Grab the cables," he directed the younger deputy. "We take the whole rack." The younger deputy reached toward the primary power supply. "I would reconsider that action," I said, stepping smoothly between the deputies and my primary workstation. Before Hayes could issue another threat, I placed my hand on the keyboard and executed a specialized macro command. Instantly, the 4 curved monitors spanning my desk shifted from their standard interface to a blinding solid red screen. A stark white Department of Defense seal materialized in the center of the displays. The cooling fans ramped up to maximum capacity, producing a loud, intimidating drone that vibrated through the floorboards. Both deputies froze their hands, hovering inches from the hardware. "You are currently standing in a classified federal workspace," I explained, dropping my voice to a sharp clinical pitch. "Those servers maintain active defense contracts for the United States government. The system you are looking at is equipped with an automated, localized wipe protocol. If you unplug a single cable tamper with the chassis or attempt to physically relocate those racks without top-secret biometric clearance, every byte of data will incinerate. Erasing classified federal intelligence constitutes a felony under the Espionage Act." I took a slow step toward Hayes, locking eyes with him. "Are you both prepared to surrender your badges, your pensions, and your freedom to execute a favor for a corrupt county judge?" The younger deputy swallowed hard, stepping back from the server rack as if the metal had suddenly turned molten. Hayes stared at the glowing red monitors, his jaw clenching so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. He pulled his radio from his shoulder strap and muttered a hushed, frantic request to a superior. The static hissed back the voice on the other end, sounding strained and panicked. I watched the color drain from Hayes's face as he realized his local county warrant was entirely worthless against a military-grade firewall. He clipped the radio back into place, his eyes flashing with raw, unfiltered humiliation. They could not touch the digital assets. Beatrice had sent them to seize my hardware, to find the digital deed, and they had hit a titanium wall. "Fine," Hayes spat the word, carrying a harsh, venomous edge. "We leave the hardware, but you are coming with us." He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, grabbing my right wrist and twisting my arm firmly behind my back. The sudden physical escalation was a desperate pivot to salvage his bruised ego. Since he could not confiscate my servers, he would confiscate me. "Natalia Campbell, you are under arrest for domestic disturbance and resisting a lawful order," he shouted, pressing his forearm against my shoulder blades to throw me off balance. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit sharply into my skin as he ratcheted them tight. The metal was freezing, shocking my nervous system, but I forced my breathing to remain shallow and rhythmic. I offered zero physical resistance, denying them any excuse to draw their weapons or escalate the force. They marched me roughly out of the server room, down the long hallway, and out the front door. The winter wind whipped across my face, stinging my cheeks as my bare feet touched the icy stone steps of my porch. The snow crunched beneath the deputies' boots as they dragged me toward the idling cruisers. Hayes shoved me toward the back of his vehicle. As he pressed a heavy hand down on my head to force me into the cramped plastic back seat, I scanned the perimeter of my estate. Parked directly across the street, idling quietly beneath the snow-covered pine trees, was a black luxury SUV. The tinted driver's side window rolled down just enough to reveal Beatrice Sterling. She held her smartphone up the camera lens, pointed directly at me, recording my humiliating march in handcuffs for her next public relations strike. She offered that same patrician smirk from the dinner table, convinced she had orchestrated my ruin. The cruiser door slammed shut, trapping me in the cage. As the vehicle accelerated down the mountain, carrying me toward a concrete holding cell, I leaned my head against the cold wire mesh. Beatrice had won the morning, but her fabricated charges had just triggered a ticking clock. I had to secure my freedom before her corrupt judge could strip away my remaining defenses. The heavy steel door slammed shut, the reverberation rattling the cinder blocks and sealing me inside a windowless holding cell. The air tasted of industrial bleach and stale sweat. The county precinct maintained the ambient temperature just above freezing, a deliberate tactic designed to erode the resolve of new inmates. I sat on the rigid metal bench, crossing my ankles to conserve body heat. The thin cotton scrubs they had issued provided zero insulation against the frigid draft leaking from the ventilation grate overhead. I did not shiver. I slowed my breathing, inhaling through my nose and exhaling a steady, controlled breath through my mouth. The local authorities expected isolation to induce panic. They wanted me to pace the length of the concrete floor, weeping and begging for a lawyer. They fundamentally misunderstood their prisoner. The biting cold of the cell faded, replaced by the blistering heat of a foreign desert. The memory surfaced with vivid clarity. 7 years ago, the convoy taking my intelligence unit through a mountain pass hit an improvised explosive device. The shockwave flipped our armored transport, tossing us like rag dolls. I remembered hanging upside down by my seatbelt, the smell of burning diesel fuel searing my lungs. Gunfire rained down on our position, the sharp cracks of automatic rifles echoing off the canyon walls. Mortar shells detonated nearby, kicking up plumes of blinding white sand. My commanding officer, the very man who later left me the Vermont estate, was bleeding out next to me. I had ignored the shrapnel embedded in my own shoulder, pulled him from the wreckage, and established a secure satellite uplink under direct hostile fire to coordinate a medical evacuation. I had stared death in the eyes amidst roaring flames and deafening explosions. Sitting in a quiet, chilly county jail cell was barely a mild inconvenience. I locked the memory away, returning my focus to the stark concrete walls. Heavy boots approached the cell. A deputy tapped his baton against the iron bars. He held a clipboard, his expression weary and bored. "The magistrate reviewed your file," he announced, his voice echoing down the corridor. "Harrison Croft set your bond at $75,000 cash. He says you are a flight risk. You get one phone call. Make it count." The exorbitant figure was a calculated maneuver. Croft intended to keep me caged through the entire holiday weekend, giving Beatrice unrestricted time to locate my hardware token and forge the digital transfer of my property. I stood up, moving with fluid, deliberate grace, and followed the deputy down the bleak hallway to a wall-mounted communal telephone. The plastic receiver felt greasy against my palm. I did not dial a local defense attorney. A civil lawyer would drown in Croft's bureaucratic red tape, wasting precious hours filing motions that the corrupt judge would simply ignore. I punched in a memorized 11-digit sequence, a secure unlisted line routed through a federal encrypted switchboard. The line rang twice. "Cole here," a deep, gravelly voice answered. Marcus Cole was a former Army Ranger who served alongside my unit during 3 separate deployments. He currently directed a specialized financial crimes task force for the Federal Bureau of Investigation out of the Boston field office. We trusted each other with our lives overseas, and that trust translated seamlessly into civilian operations. Marcus it is, Natalia, I said, keeping my tone hushed and precise. I am currently detained in the county precinct. The local judge just issued a fabricated warrant to raid my servers. My mother-in-law is initiating a hostile takeover of my estate. I heard the distinct sound of a chair rolling across a hardwood floor, followed by the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard. Marcus did not ask clarifying questions. He operated on facts and rapid response. Give me her name and business entities, he instructed. Beatrice Sterling, I replied. She operates Sterling Public Relations and several regional holding firms. I need a backdoor diagnostic on her liquidity. Something is forcing her hand. The line went silent except for the frantic keystrokes. I watched the deputy checking his watch, eager to return me to the cage. 1 minute later, Marcus stopped typing. His exhale hissed through the receiver. Natalia, he said, his tone shifting into predatory focus. Beatrice Sterling is drowning. I just bypassed her commercial banking firewalls. Her liquid assets are non-existent. She has leveraged every single property she owns to the maximum limit. Her firm is facing a catastrophic debt default by the end of the fiscal quarter. I processed the intel, the pieces of the puzzle locking together with lethal precision. The extravagant galas, the designer wardrobe, the vintage pearls, all of it was a hollow facade built on a crumbling foundation of debt. She did not just want my timber frame house to live in. She needed a clean, unencumbered asset worth millions to use as fresh collateral. My sanctuary was her only lifeline to avoid total financial ruin. Thank you, Marcus, I murmured. Keep monitoring those accounts. I am coming for her ledgers next. I hung up the receiver, placing it back on the metal hook. I turned to the deputy. I am ready to post my bond. He let out a harsh laugh, gesturing to my thin cotton scrubs. You do not have 75 grand in your pockets. Call a bondsman. I maintained steady eye contact. The county portal allows for digital bond payments. I require access to the supervised booking terminal to process the transaction. He frowned, irritated by my knowledge of the local precinct protocols, but he escorted me to a thick plastic desk in the processing area. A heavy desktop computer sat bolted to the table. He logged in with his credentials, stepping back while keeping his hand near his utility belt. He expected me to log into a domestic checking account and watch the transaction decline. Instead, I opened a secure incognito browser window. My fingers flew across the sticky keys. I bypassed the standard American banking grid entirely, accessing a decentralized offshore cryptocurrency wallet. I maintained this specific ledger using funds gathered from high-level international security bounties. The untraceable digital currency sat well outside the jurisdiction of local magistrates. I initiated a rapid conversion sequence, routing the required funds through 3 separate international proxy servers in under 40 seconds. I pasted the generated payment token directly into the county court holding portal. The screen refreshed, displaying a bright green confirmation receipt. The bond was paid in full. I stood up, stepping away from the terminal. The deputy stared at the monitor, his jaw hanging slightly open as his brain struggled to comprehend the instantaneous transfer of wealth by a woman wearing jail scrubs. Process my release forms, I instructed, my voice unwavering. It took an hour of bureaucratic shuffling to retrieve my personal belongings. The moment I laced up my winter boots and secured my wool coat, the heavy glass doors of the precinct slid open. The bitter wind bit into my cheeks as I stepped out onto the salted pavement. I was a free woman, armed with the knowledge that my enemies were desperate, bankrupt, and highly vulnerable. I hailed a rideshare vehicle, directing the driver to a nondescript industrial park on the outskirts of town where I kept an off-the-grid backup facility. I needed to establish a secure connection and begin dismantling Beatrice's shell companies. As the sedan navigated the slick, snow-covered roads, I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and powered it on. A barrage of notifications flooded the screen. I opened my primary domestic banking application to check the status of my civilian accounts. A stark, unyielding banner blocked my access. The text read, "All assets frozen by emergency judicial order." Harrison Croft had not just set an exorbitant bail, he had signed a secondary injunction, effectively locking every domestic account, credit line, and business asset tied to my name. A mocking text message from Julian illuminated the screen, feigning concern, while suggesting I surrender the deed before I starved to death in the cold. They thought they had severed my supply lines. They thought I was bleeding out in the snow, unaware that I had a hidden arsenal waiting in the dark. The rideshare sedan pulled away, its taillights fading into the biting Vermont winter. I stood alone in the desolate parking lot of a sprawling commercial park. Corrugated steel buildings stretched out in uniform gray rows. To the casual observer, Unit 42 appeared to be just another forgotten storage bay, holding rusted landscaping equipment or stacked pallets. In reality, it housed a climate-controlled, off-the-grid command center I had constructed years ago. I approached the reinforced steel door, stripping off my heavy wool glove. The bitter wind bit at my knuckles as I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner concealed beneath a weatherproof plate. A green LED flashed, followed by the heavy mechanical thud of military-grade deadbolts retracting in unison. I pushed the door open and stepped into the pitch-black interior. The moment the threshold sealed behind me, motion sensors engaged. Rows of recessed overhead lights hummed to life, casting a stark white glow over dual commercial server racks and a sleek, minimalist glass desk. The air inside smelled faintly of ozone and heated copper wiring. It was the scent of raw, unfiltered processing power. I shrugged off my winter coat, tossing it over a leather chair, and took my seat at the primary terminal. My immediate priority was assessing the damage Harrison Croft had inflicted on my domestic infrastructure. I tapped the spacebar, waking the 4 curved high-definition monitors spanning my desk. I launched an encrypted browser and navigated to my primary banking portal. A stark, unyielding banner dominated the screen. The text glared in bright red pixels, stating that an emergency judicial injunction had been enacted. My checking, savings, and investment portfolios were locked. I opened a secondary tab, attempting to access the corporate accounts tied to my civilian consulting firm. The identical red warning greeted me. The local judge had weaponized his authority to enact a total financial freeze. Every single dollar held within the United States banking system under my name was inaccessible. My smartphone vibrated against the glass desk, the sudden noise sharp in the quiet room. The screen illuminated with an incoming text message from Julian. I stared at his name for a fraction of a second before opening the notification. "Natalia, please stop this. You have nothing left. Mom spoke to the judge and your accounts are seized until the conservatorship is settled. Sign the deed and we can get you a warm bed and the psychiatric care you need today. Do not freeze out there." I analyzed his words, reading the subtext woven into his feigned husbandly concern. He was attempting to play the role of the benevolent savior while holding a knife to my throat. Julian and Beatrice believed they had executed a flawless siege. By cutting off my capital, they assumed I could not hire a defense attorney, secure a hotel room, or purchase a single meal. They expected me to break under the weight of sudden poverty. They expected me to crawl back to my stolen estate, hand over the biometric hardware token, and surrender my freedom for a heated room. Their strategy relied entirely on a fundamental misunderstanding of my professional history. Long before I purchased the timber frame estate, I spent years operating as an independent security contractor for international defense firms. My job entailed probing the logistics networks of European aerospace manufacturers, hunting for zero-day vulnerabilities before hostile state actors could exploit them. I fortified digital perimeters that protected classified weapons schematics. Those elite defense contractors did not compensate me with direct deposits into a local Vermont credit union. They paid me in decentralized, untraceable cryptocurrency. I pushed Julian's pathetic message aside and brought up a command line interface on my center monitor. The domestic financial blockade was an inconvenience, not a checkmate. I initiated an intricate dark web routing protocol, a custom script I had compiled during my time overseas. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking filling the quiet room. I commanded the system to bounce my connection signal across the Atlantic. The routing trace mapped across my screen, pinging a secure relay server hidden in a Zurich data center. From Switzerland, the signal fragmented and bounced northward, tunneling into a decentralized server farm buried deep underground in Reykjavik, Iceland. My digital footprint became a ghost, impossible for any local magistrate or county sheriff to track. With the encrypted tunnel established, I accessed my cold storage wallet. The decryption keys tumbled into place, unlocking a vault filled with high-level security bounties. The balance displayed on my monitor rivaled the entire valuation of Beatrice's public relations firm. I initiated a rapid conversion sequence. The script translated the decentralized tokens into usable liquid capital, routing the newly generated funds into a series of anonymous digital debit accounts. Within 12 minutes, I had bypassed the judicial embargo entirely. The virtual cards synced to the encrypted wallet on my phone, ready for immediate use. Julian and his mother were likely sitting in her opulent living room toasting their supposed victory, with expensive champagne celebrating my impending ruin. Meanwhile, I sat bathed in the glow of my monitors, fully funded, highly armed, with digital leverage and stripped of any lingering hesitation. The defensive phase of this war had officially ended. It was time to shift to a relentless offense. I opened a new terminal window, dragging it to the center display. Beatrice believed her wealth and social status provided an impenetrable shield, but true power does not reside in country club memberships or vintage pearls. True power lies in the flow of data, and she had carelessly left her digital doors unguarded. I typed a sequence of reconnaissance commands, directing my probe toward the public-facing IP addresses registered to Sterling Public Relations and its associated regional holding companies. I needed to understand why she was so desperate to steal my clean, unencumbered real estate. A woman projecting the illusion of generational wealth does not risk felony extortion unless a much larger threat is looming over her head. The initial ping returned a packet of network architecture data. I studied the security framework protecting her corporate servers. A cold, cynical smile touched the corners of my mouth. Beatrice had spared no expense on her designer wardrobe, yet she had outsourced her corporate cybersecurity to a budget commercial vendor. Her firewall was an off-the-shelf software package, the kind of basic perimeter defense designed to deter amateur hackers and bored teenagers. It was a paper shield. I engaged a specialized penetration testing suite, launching a silent probing algorithm against her primary administrative gateway. I watched the progress bar inch forward as my software analyzed the structural integrity of her network, hunting for the microscopic cracks in her digital foundation. The code cascaded in brilliant green lines, filtering through the mundane traffic of email servers and public marketing portfolios. I was looking for the hidden ledgers. I was searching for the shadow accounts that funded her extravagant lifestyle. The algorithm paused, flashing a bright yellow alert on the screen. It had discovered an anomalous encrypted partition buried deep beneath the standard accounting software. The file structure did not match typical public relations billing records. It was deliberately concealed, locked behind a secondary administrative password. My pulse settled into a steady, predatory rhythm. The bait was in the water, and the scent of corporate fraud radiated from the screen. I flexed my fingers, preparing to breach the encrypted partition. Beatrice wanted to play a game of ruin, and I was about to show her what true destruction looked like. The anomalous encrypted partition pulsing on my center monitor required a delicate touch. Brute force tactics would trigger an automated lockdown, instantly alerting Beatrice's outsourced tech vendor to my presence. I needed to pick the digital lock without leaving a single scratch on the casing. During my deployments, my commanding officer constantly reminded our intelligence unit that impatience gets operatives killed. The exact same rule applies to network infiltration. I loaded a custom dictionary attack script into the command line feeding the software permutations of Beatrice's public life. I input her vanity license plates, her late husband's birth date, the founding year of her exclusive country club, and the names of her purebred spaniels. The algorithm cycled through thousands of combinations a second. The screen illuminated my face in a cold blue hue as I waited, listening to the rhythmic hum of the server cooling fans. 2 minutes later, the prompt flashed green. Access granted. The files unpacked into a sprawling labyrinth of spreadsheets, tax filings, and shadow ledgers. Beatrice Sterling portrayed herself to the New England elite as a titan of public relations, a sophisticated tastemaker who shaped local politics. The reality, hidden in these folders, painted a starkly different portrait. She was a scavenger. I filtered the incoming revenue streams, ignoring the legitimate boutique invoices for charity galas and political campaigns. My focus centered on a series of steady, high-yield cash injections originating from a commercial construction holding firm. I cross-referenced the employer identification numbers, digging into the origin of the capital. The money was not earned revenue. It was capital siphoned directly from a regional laborers' union pension fund. Beatrice had established a web of phantom shell corporations, generating fake billing invoices for consulting work that never existed. She was bleeding the retirement savings of blue-collar workers to fund her vintage pearls, her leased luxury vehicles, and her opulent lifestyle. White-collar theft creates a relentless ticking clock. A federal footprint always draws scrutiny. I opened a subfolder labeled Q3 Compliance. Inside sat a confidential notice from the Internal Revenue Service dated 3 weeks ago. The federal agency was initiating a comprehensive audit of her primary holding company. If auditors reviewed her ledgers, the phantom invoices would crumble, exposing the stolen union funds. She needed to replace the missing pension capital before the audit commenced, or she would face decades in a federal penitentiary. I toggled over to her recent loan applications. She had approached multiple commercial lenders seeking a 7-figure bridge loan. Every single bank had rejected her due to her toxic debt-to-income ratio. She needed clean, unencumbered collateral to secure the cash. I pulled up a localized zoning map saved in her real estate folder. A highlighted red boundary circled my timber frame estate in Vermont. My property sat squarely on a unique municipal fault line, qualifying it for a highly lucrative state-funded commercial development grant aimed at rural revitalization. Beatrice did not care about my reclaimed wood beams or the quiet snowfall outside my windows. She intended to seize my sanctuary, leverage the deed against the state grant, and use the incoming capital to plug the gaping hole in her pension fraud scheme before the federal auditors arrived. My home was her literal get-out-of-jail-free card. I dug deeper into the signatory documents authorizing the shell company transfers. A familiar, looping signature graced the bottom of every fraudulent invoice. Julian. My husband had not merely turned a blind eye to his mother's extortion at our Christmas dinner table. He was the primary authorized agent on the phantom accounts. Beatrice had insulated herself, placing her own son directly in the crosshairs of federal liability. He was blindly taking the legal risk for her theft, desperate for her approval and a share of the stolen wealth. The betrayal crystallized in my chest, hardening my resolve into something cold and sharp. They were willing to lock me in a psychiatric ward to save themselves from a prison cell. The structure of any criminal syndicate always requires a shield. Embezzling union pensions and orchestrating hostile property takeovers in broad daylight necessitates local protection. I initiated a tracking algorithm on the outgoing wire transfers from the primary shell corporation. The software chewed through the data packets, filtering out mundane operational expenses like payroll and utility bills. A recurring high-value anomaly surfaced on the screen. On the first day of every single month, a wire transfer for exactly $60,000 departed the account. The funds did not flow to a domestic vendor. They bounced through a clearinghouse in Delaware before landing in a secure private trust registered in the Cayman Islands. Offshore trusts are specifically designed to obscure the identity of the beneficiary, wrapping the owner in layers of international banking secrecy. But digital anonymity is often a fragile illusion for those who know where to apply pressure. I launched a cryptographic key breaker against the Cayman Bank's routing portal. I did not need to dismantle their entire mainframe. I only needed to pry open the specific data packet attached to that recurring monthly deposit. The terminal processed the heavy decryption protocols. The cooling fans in my server rack roared in protest, struggling to dissipate the heat generated by the intense processing load. I watched the progress bar inch across the display, counting the seconds. After 4 agonizing minutes, the security wall fractured. The beneficiary file rendered on my screen in crisp, undeniable text. The trust fund belonged to Judge Harrison Croft. The conspiracy stood exposed in breathtaking clarity. Beatrice Sterling was paying a sitting county judge a premium monthly retainer to weaponize the judicial system on her behalf. Croft had signed the fabricated search warrant to raid my servers. Croft had enacted the draconian financial freeze to starve me out. Croft was preparing to grant the emergency conservatorship that would strip my legal autonomy and hand my estate over to a criminal syndicate. They believed their alliance of old money and corrupt authority made them invincible. They assumed I was just a discarded daughter-in-law broken by combat and easily swept aside. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating an intelligence operative. I saved the offshore ledgers, the union pension routing numbers, and the extortion emails onto an encrypted offline drive. I now possess the digital evidence required to eradicate their entire network. However, digital leverage only functions if you live to deploy it. My primary biometric YubiKey remained secured on my belt, but I kept a physical, hard-coded backup token hidden inside a false floorboard in my Vermont study. If Beatrice's hired attorneys somehow manipulated the court into sending a locksmith and a receiver to my home, they might stumble upon the failsafe. I could not leave any loose ends on the board. I ejected the encrypted drive and slipped it into the inner pocket of my coat. I needed to return to the estate, retrieve the backup token, and pack a tactical go-bag before the morning conservatorship hearing. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the industrial park in a quiet, freezing whiteout. I locked the command center and stepped out into the bitter wind. My breath plumed in the frigid air as I walked toward my vehicle, entirely unaware that the battlefield was about to shift from a digital chessboard to a visceral physical confrontation inside my own home. The drive back up the winding mountain roads demanded sharp, unwavering focus. Black ice coated the asphalt beneath a fresh, unpredictable layer of Vermont snow. My vehicle gripped the treacherous terrain, navigating the familiar elevation leading to my timber frame estate. I needed to retrieve my tactical go-bag and the hard-coded backup YubiKey concealed beneath a false floorboard in my study. The offshore digital evidence currently secured in my coat pocket was potent, but safeguarding the physical failsafe token remained a critical operational priority. As my tires crunched toward the property boundary, an anomaly registered in my peripheral vision. I slowed the engine to a low hum, parking in the dense shadow of a towering pine grove 50 yards from the main entrance. The heavy iron security gates stood ajar. The digital keypad indicator, normally glowing a steady blue, was dark. Someone had manually overridden the perimeter defense grid. The realization clicked into place. Julian had lived in this house for 3 years. While I had initiated a lockdown during our holiday dinner, I had not yet cycled the secondary analog bypass codes. It was a rare logistical oversight on my part, one my husband had decided to exploit. I stepped out of the vehicle into the biting chill. The wind whipped snow against my face, stinging my cheeks. I bypassed the main driveway, choosing instead to move along the tree line. My boots navigated the deep powder in silence. I approached the side mudroom entrance. The heavy wooden door sat slightly off its hinges, the deadbolt splintered from brute force. Julian possessed the analog codes for the gate, but he lacked the biometric clearance for the house itself. He had resorted to breaking and entering. I slipped through the threshold, letting the freezing draft mask the sound of my entry. The interior of the estate was pitch black, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the frosted window panes. A profound quiet usually characterized my home, but tonight a chaotic cadence of destruction echoed down the main corridor. Wood splintered, glass shattered, heavy, ragged breathing resonated from the far end of the hall. I moved with the fluid, deliberate silence drilled into me during my military deployments. I placed each step carefully on the reclaimed hardwood, avoiding the sections I knew would creak. The scent of drywall dust and aged paper filled the stagnant air. The noise emanated directly from my private study, the exact room housing the concealed floorboard and the backup token. I reached the open doorway and merged with the shadows of the frame. The room was a disaster zone. Books lay scattered across the rug, their pages torn. The drawers of my mahogany desk had been yanked out and tossed aside. In the center of the wreckage stood my husband. Julian was sweating profusely, his custom Italian wool coat covered in plaster dust. His chest heaved as he tore through my filing cabinets. Gripped tightly in his right hand was the heavy, antique iron fireplace poker, the exact tool he had admired during our tense Christmas Eve dinner. He swung the iron bar into the side of my desk, splintering the polished wood. He was frantic, driven by the desperate realization that his mother's empire was crumbling and his own neck sat squarely on the chopping block. He needed that backup token to forge the property transfer and save himself from federal prison. "Put the iron down, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos like a surgical blade. Julian spun around, startled by my sudden appearance. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and darting around the room before locking onto me. He tightened his grip on the fireplace poker. The cowardice that usually defined his posture was replaced by a cornered, arrogant desperation. He looked at my frame standing quietly in the doorway and falsely calculated that his height and the heavy weapon granted him the upper hand. "You ruined everything, Natalia," Julian spat, pointing the iron tip toward my chest. "My mother is facing a liquidity crisis because you refused to cooperate. The state development grant attached to this land is the only thing that can balance our ledgers. Hand over the backup token right now. We are taking this estate with or without your sanity intact." I did not raise my voice. I did not assume a defensive stance. I kept my hands relaxed at my sides. "You broke into my sanctuary. You are destroying my property. I will give you one final opportunity to drop the weapon and walk out the front door." Julian sneered, an ugly twisting of his features. "You are just a paranoid soldier playing house. You do not give the orders here anymore." He lunged forward. He swung the heavy iron poker in a clumsy, sweeping downward arc, aiming directly for my collarbone. He put his entire body weight into the strike, a desperate attempt to incapacitate me and take what he wanted by force. He forgot that the military spent years turning my reflexes into a lethal, automated response system. I stepped inside his guard, slipping smoothly past the descending trajectory of the iron bar. The weapon sliced through empty air, throwing him entirely off balance. Before his brain could register the missed target, I drove the rigid edge of my palm directly into the brachial plexus nerve cluster in his bicep. The strike delivered a paralyzing shockwave through his arm. Julian gasped in sudden, blinding pain. His fingers went numb instantly, releasing the fireplace poker. The heavy iron clattered uselessly onto the hardwood floor. I did not give him a fraction of a second to recover. I seized his wrist, twisting his arm sharply behind his back to lock his shoulder joint. I planted my boot behind his knee and executed a swift leg sweep. His legs buckled. Julian crashed face first into the floorboards, knocking the breath from his lungs in a loud, hollow wheeze. I dropped my weight fluidly, driving my knee directly between his shoulder blades, pinning him flat against the ground. I maintained upward pressure on his locked wrist, ensuring any sudden movement would dislocate his shoulder. The entire physical altercation concluded in under 3 seconds. My spineless husband groaned in agony, his face pressed uncomfortably against the dusty rug. The arrogant swagger he had displayed moments ago vanished, replaced by pathetic whimpering. The golden boy of the Sterling family was immobilized effortlessly in the very room he sought to destroy. "Are we finished negotiating?" I asked, keeping my breathing perfectly steady. Julian writhed beneath my knee, unable to break the joint lock. Spite and humiliation radiated from his trembling frame. He knew he could not defeat me physically, so he attempted to strike a psychological blow. "You think you won?" Julian wheezed, his cheeks smeared with plaster dust. "You are too late. My mother hired Edward Preston. He is the most ruthless attorney in Burlington. They filed an emergency motion to declare you mentally incompetent. The judge fast-tracked the conservatorship hearing for tomorrow morning. You have a mandatory deposition at Preston's firm in 3 hours. They are going to lock you in a state hospital forever." I absorbed the tactical update. Beatrice was escalating the timeline, rushing the legal theft of my estate before the federal auditors uncovered her embezzled union pension funds. She was deploying her high-priced lawyer to corner me in a boardroom, intending to use psychological warfare to force a surrender. I shifted my weight, releasing the joint lock just enough to haul Julian to his feet by the collar of his expensive wool coat. He stumbled forward, clutching his bruised arm, his eyes wide with fear. I marched him out of the study, pushing him firmly down the dark corridor toward the front entrance. I pulled the heavy oak door open, exposing the freezing mountain wind. I shoved him hard between the shoulder blades. Julian tumbled down the stone steps, landing unceremoniously in a deep snowdrift on the front lawn. He scrambled backward, shivering in the bitter cold, staring up at me from the ground. "Tell your mother I will attend the deposition," I stated, staring down at him. "I look forward to meeting her lawyer." I slammed the door shut, engaging the heavy deadbolts. Leaving him to freeze on the driveway, I walked back to my study. I located the pristine floorboard beneath my desk, pressed the concealed latch, and retrieved the hard-coded backup YubiKey. I packed my tactical go bag with essential hardware, secure communication devices, and the encrypted drive containing the offshore banking ledgers. The trap was set for tomorrow morning, but first I needed to visit a high-end Burlington law firm and deliver a digital payload they would never see coming. The drive into downtown Burlington offered a stark contrast to the quiet isolation of my mountain estate. Sleek glass high-rises reflected the pale morning sun. I parked my vehicle in an underground garage and navigated toward the premier legal address in the city. The law firm of Preston & Associates occupied the entire 30th floor of a corporate tower. Stepping off the elevator, I noted the Italian marble floors, the frosted glass partitions, and the hushed, reverent tone of the reception area. This environment was engineered to intimidate civilians. It was built to make visitors feel small, uneducated, and entirely at the mercy of expensive legal expertise. I approached the receptionist, handing her my identification. She guided me down a long corridor flanked by expansive windows overlooking the icy waters of Lake Champlain. We entered a sprawling conference room dominated by a polished mahogany table. Sitting on the far side, flanked by tall leather executive chairs, were my mother-in-law and her hired attack dog, Edward Preston. Preston wore a bespoke pinstripe suit that cost more than most vehicles. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his posture radiating unearned superiority. He reviewed a stack of documents, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Beatrice sat next to him wearing a somber charcoal dress, clutching a pristine white handkerchief. She dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes, performing the role of a devastated, concerned matriarch. They looked up as I took my seat across from them, resting my hands flat on the cool wood of the table. "Good morning, Mrs. Campbell," Preston began, his tone dripping with patronizing sympathy. "We appreciate you attending this deposition on such short notice. We know this is a highly stressful period for you." "I am here to fulfill the court mandate, Mr. Preston," I replied, my voice devoid of inflection. "You may proceed." Preston offered a tight, artificial smile. He slid a thick stack of medical and legal paperwork across the table. The pages stopped inches from my hands. He tapped the top document with a gold-plated pen. "What we have here is a sworn affidavit from a certified psychiatric professional," he explained, leaning forward to close the distance between us. "Dr. Aris conducted a thorough review of your service records and recent behavior. His diagnosis is severe unmanaged combat trauma, resulting in acute paranoia and delusions. He recommends immediate long-term institutionalization for your own safety and the safety of the public." I did not touch the folder. I kept my gaze locked on Preston. "You procured a diagnosis from a physician who has never conducted an in-person evaluation." Beatrice let out a soft, theatrical sob. She reached across the table, extending her hand as if to comfort me. "Natalia, please listen to us," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "You locked Julian out in the freezing cold. You attacked him in your own study last night. You are not well. We are terrified you might hurt yourself. We just want to get you the professional help you deserve." I ignored her outstretched hand. "You want the estate, Beatrice. Your concern is remarkably timed with your looming commercial debt default." Preston intervened, attempting to regain control of the narrative. He steepled his fingers together, projecting clinical authority. "Mrs. Campbell, your combat record indicates prolonged exposure to hostile environments. You hold a Distinguished Service Cross. While society honors your sacrifice, the reality is that war leaves invisible scars. Your recent erratic actions leave my client no choice. We have filed an emergency conservatorship motion. Judge Harrison Croft is presiding over the hearing tomorrow morning." He let the name hang in the air, ensuring I understood the gravity of the threat. Preston knew Croft was on the payroll. He assumed I was a helpless pawn caught in their rigged judicial game. Preston leaned back in his leather chair, delivering the ultimatum. "You have two options today. You can sign this quitclaim deed transferring the Vermont property to the Sterling Family Trust. If you cooperate, we will withdraw the conservatorship petition and fund a private quiet recovery program of your choosing." "And the second option?" I asked. The facade of sympathy vanished from the lawyer face. "If you refuse, we walk into Judge Croft's courtroom tomorrow. He will review these psychiatric affidavits and declare you a ward of the state. You will be stripped of your autonomy. You will be placed in a locked state facility indefinitely. You will lose the house, your freedom, and your dignity. The choice is yours." He pushed the gold pen across the mahogany surface. It rolled to a stop right next to the fraudulent medical file. They sat in silence, waiting for the inevitable surrender. They expected the crushing weight of institutional threat to break my resolve. I inhaled a slow, controlled breath. My military training dictated that you never engage an enemy on their preferred battlefield. You shift the parameters of the engagement. I pushed my chair back from the table. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my dark wool trousers. "I am of sound mind, Mr. Preston. I will not be signing a single document today, and I will see you in court tomorrow." Preston scowled, his cheeks flushing with irritation. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, Mrs. Campbell. You cannot win a fight against the entire legal system." I reached for my heavy winter coat draped over the back of the chair. As I lifted the garment, I allowed my numbed fingers to deliberately fumble. A generic black USB flash drive slipped from my pocket. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp clatter, bouncing once before settling near Preston's legal pad. I did not flinch. I did not break my stride. I turned my back on the lawyer and my mother-in-law, walking straight out of the boardroom without a backward glance. I left the drive sitting there, an irresistible piece of digital bait. I navigated the elevator down to the parking garage, returning to the driver's seat of my vehicle. The interior was freezing, but I did not turn on the engine. I unzipped my tactical go bag and pulled out my secure, encrypted laptop. I rested the device on the steering wheel, booting up my custom monitoring interface. Edward Preston was an arrogant man who believed he held total superiority. An attorney of his caliber facing a defiant pro se defendant would never ignore a piece of abandoned hardware. He would assume the flash drive contained my private financial records, my defense strategy, or a drafted settlement offer. His ego would demand he plug it into a computer to steal my secrets. 8 minutes later, a bright green notification flared in the corner of my dark screen. Preston had taken the bait. He connected the USB drive to his firm workstation. The hardware appeared to his system as a standard storage device containing a folder labeled Financial Disclosures. But the moment his operating system read the directory, a custom zero-day payload executed in the background. The malware was a ghost. It bypassed the commercial firewalls guarding the law firm network, slipping silently past their internal antivirus protocols. It established an encrypted two-way tunnel directly linking Preston's computer to my laptop in the parking garage. Lines of code cascaded across my screen as the payload mapped the firm directory. I possessed unrestricted, invisible access to their entire legal network. Client-attorney privilege dissolved beneath my keystrokes. I bypassed the administrative locks on Preston's private email client, downloading years of confidential communications, settlement drafts, and internal memorandums. I initiated a targeted keyword search, hunting for Beatrice Sterling and Judge Harrison Croft. The search algorithm chewed through the data packets, pulling hundreds of incriminating files. The extortion was documented in stark black and white text. They treated the destruction of my life as a casual business transaction, coordinating the fabricated medical evidence with terrifying precision. I began transferring the digital evidence, securing the files onto an offline drive. My strategy was falling into place flawlessly. But as I monitored their internal communications, a sudden high-priority email hit Preston's inbox, flagged with urgent red markers. The sender was a boutique private medical clinic located on the outskirts of Burlington. I opened the intercepted message, reading the subject line. It detailed an emergency media briefing scheduled for that exact hour. Beatrice was not waiting for the courtroom hearing. She was escalating the conflict far beyond a simple property dispute. A new notification pinged on my phone, pulling my attention away from the legal network. The local news stations were broadcasting breaking coverage, and my mother-in-law was the headline. The digital glow of the laptop illuminated the frost gathering on the inside of my windshield. My breath plumed in the freezing cabin of the SUV. The heating system remained off to conserve the battery while my custom monitoring interface processed the intercepted data packets from Edward Preston's law firm. A sharp chime echoed through the vehicle speakers. The urgent email notification I had just intercepted contained a hyperlink to a live local news broadcast. I tapped the touchpad, expanding the video feed across the center of my screen. The sterile, bright aesthetic of a hospital room filled the display. But this was no standard emergency ward. The walls featured textured silk wallpaper, and the bedding boasted high thread count Egyptian cotton. It was Summit Wellness Center, a concierge medical boutique catering to the Burlington elite. Sitting in the center of the pristine bed was my mother-in-law. Beatrice Sterling wore a rigid cervical collar wrapped tightly around her neck. Her hair, usually sprayed into a flawless helmet of blonde perfection, hung in limp strands across her forehead. Julian sat beside the bed holding her hand, his head bowed in a posture of profound manufactured grief. A local news reporter stood near the doorway, holding a microphone with solemn reverence. The camera zoomed in on Beatrice's face. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing a single trembling tear to trace a path down her cheek. She broke in, Beatrice whispered, her voice a raspy theatrical croak. My daughter-in-law bypassed the security system. I tried to reason with her. I tried to offer her a peaceful settlement, but Natalia is suffering from severe delusions. She cornered me near the second-floor landing. She screamed that I would never take her sanctuary, and then she shoved me. Beatrice paused, letting out a sharp, staged gasp of pain, clutching the edges of her blanket. I tumbled down the entire staircase, she wept, staring directly into the camera lens. I felt my spine crack. The doctors say I might require reconstructive surgery. I am terrified for my life, and I am terrified for my son. She is a trained soldier, and she is hunting her own family. The broadcast cut back to the grim-faced reporter in the studio. The anchor adjusted his papers, adopting a grave tone. Authorities are responding swiftly to this tragic development. The district attorney, acting on expedited orders from Judge Harrison Croft, is currently finalizing a no-bail felony arrest warrant for Natalia Campbell. Law enforcement officials consider the former Army intelligence operative armed and highly dangerous. Citizens are advised to report any sightings immediately. The screen transitioned to a commercial break. I sat back against the cold leather seat of my vehicle. The trap was engineered to be inescapable. The psychological warfare in the boardroom had failed to break my resolve. I had walked out, refusing to sign the quitclaim deed. Recognizing that their timeline was collapsing, before the impending federal audit, Beatrice pivoted to a catastrophic false flag operation. A no-bail felony warrant meant immediate incarceration. It meant bypassing the civil conservatorship hearing entirely. Once locked in a county cell without the option to pay my bond, I would lose my security clearances, my civilian contracts, and my ability to defend my property. Judge Croft would push the deed transfer through the system while I sat behind bars, branded a violent predator. My heart rate remained steady, beating at a calm 60 pulses per minute. The situation appeared dire to any civilian observer, but through the encrypted tunnel connected to Preston's law firm, I possessed total dramatic irony. I saw the strings manipulating the marionettes. I knew Summit Wellness Center was owned by a physician who regularly golfed with Judge Croft. The official medical file generated by that clinic would be heavily doctored to support the spinal trauma narrative. But Beatrice had made a critical tactical error. To sell the narrative to her wealthy neighbors and ensure a rapid police response, she had to dial emergency services from her mansion. She did not drive herself to the boutique clinic. A municipal ambulance transported her. County paramedics do not work for concierge doctors. They operate on standard regional dispatch grids, utilizing encrypted triage tablets to log incident data in real time. Those raw files sync to the municipal servers before the patient even reaches the hospital doors. I just needed to intercept that raw transmission before the boutique physician scrubbed the official record. I opened a new terminal window on my laptop. The temperature in the car dropped further, numbing my fingertips, but I ignored the discomfort. I executed a tunneling script, routing my connection through the secure proxy servers in Iceland to mask my location. I directed the probe toward the Vermont Regional Emergency Medical Services database. Municipal firewalls are notoriously rigid, designed to protect sensitive health information, but they suffer from outdated patching protocols. I identified a vulnerability in their third-party billing gateway. It took me 7 minutes of rapid coding to bypass the authentication perimeter. I slipped inside the dispatch network entirely undetected. I ran a query for the Sterling residential address, filtering the results for emergency responses dispatched within the last 4 hours. A single hit populated my screen. Unit 4 had responded to a reported fall trauma. I accessed the raw, unedited XML file uploaded by the attending paramedic. The data rendered in stark, undeniable text. I scanned the vital signs logged at the scene. Blood pressure normal, heart rate steady, oxygen saturation optimal. The patient did not exhibit the physiological shock responses consistent with a severe spinal injury. I scrolled down to the paramedic narrative notes, hunting for the specific observations recorded during the physical assessment. The text leaped off the glowing screen, sealing Beatrice's fate. Patient presented sitting upright on the floor near the staircase, the paramedic wrote. Complained of intense cervical pain. Applied rigid collar per protocol. During secondary assessment of the neck region, noted dark purple discoloration resembling severe bruising. Applied a standard saline flush to clean the area for palpation. The discoloration dissolved immediately upon contact with moisture. Texture and residue resemble synthetic theatrical cosmetics. Zero structural trauma detected along the vertebrae. Patient became highly uncooperative and combative when questioned about the dissolving bruising. Patient demanded transport to Summit Wellness Center and refused county trauma ward. A slow, freezing smile touched my lips. She had painted fake bruises on her neck to sell the performance to the emergency responders. The paramedic caught the deception, documenting the cosmetic residue in the official incident log. The raw timestamp on the file proved it was submitted hours before the tearful television broadcast. This was not just a lie, it was felony perjury. It was filing a false police report and a coordinated conspiracy to defraud the judicial system. Beatrice and Julian had handed me the exact digital gasoline required to burn their entire syndicate to the ground. I initiated a bulk download sequence. I extracted the unedited XML triage file, the server audit logs, proving the timestamp and the digital signature of the attending paramedic. I verified the encryption hashes, ensuring the evidence was pristine and admissible in any federal court. I saved the files to my secure offline drive alongside the Cayman Island banking ledgers and the extortion emails. The arsenal was fully stocked. I closed the laptop, severing the connection to the municipal grid. Outside my windshield, the afternoon sun began to dip behind the Vermont mountains, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete parking garage. The local authorities were actively hunting me. The district attorney would issue the arrest warrant within the hour. Returning to my timber frame estate was tactical suicide. Law enforcement would establish a perimeter around the property, waiting for me to trigger their trap. I could not hide in the shadows anymore. If they wanted a spectacle, I would give them a slaughter. I started the engine, the heater roaring to life, blasting warm air into the freezing cabin. I navigated out of the parking structure, merging into the sparse downtown traffic. I needed to secure a hotel room under an alias, rest, and prepare my uniform. The emergency conservatorship hearing was scheduled for the following morning. Beatrice, Julian, and Judge Croft expected a broken, terrified woman to be dragged into their courtroom in handcuffs. They were going to face an operative ready to detonate their entire reality. I shifted the vehicle into gear, heading toward the eye of the storm. The morning air carried a bitter frost as I navigated the concrete steps leading to the county courthouse. A chaotic swarm of local reporters and independent journalists clogged the entry plaza. They held recording devices like weapons, shouting rapid-fire questions regarding my mental stability and the supposed stairway assault on my mother-in-law. I kept my gaze fixed forward, offering zero reaction to the flashing camera bulbs or the shouted accusations. In hostile territory, you ignore the noise and focus entirely on the objective. I bypassed the anxious civil defense attorneys pacing the grand lobby. Walking directly to the clerk desk, I submitted the finalized paperwork to represent myself pro se. The clerk stamped the file, her eyes darting nervously toward my lapel. Pinned securely to the thick fabric of my tailored navy wool suit was the bronze Distinguished Service Cross. The metal gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor. It stood as a tangible symbol of survival earned in the dust and blood of a foreign ambush. Today, it would serve a much different tactical purpose. I pushed through the heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B. The gallery hummed with a restless, hungry energy packed shoulder to shoulder with spectators eager to document the downfall of a decorated veteran. I took my seat at the defense table alone. At the plaintiff table, Beatrice performed her role with sickening dedication. A rigid cervical collar encased her neck, propping her chin at an uncomfortable angle. Julian hovered behind her chair, resting a hand on her shoulder to project the image of a devoted, grieving son. Edward Preston stood near his briefcase, adjusting his expensive silk tie, radiating unearned confidence. Judge Harrison Croft entered from his chambers, his black robes billowing around his wide frame. He struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block, demanding immediate silence. His eyes locked onto me, carrying a cold, dismissive arrogance. He viewed me as a nuisance, a temporary roadblock standing between him and a lucrative offshore payday. Preston initiated the proceeding by calling Beatrice to the witness stand. The bailiff swore her in. Preston guided her through a fabricated narrative engineered to elicit maximum sympathy from the gallery. Beatrice produced a pristine lace handkerchief, dabbing her dry eyes while she spun a tale of terror. She described me as a fractured paranoid soldier who had shoved her down a flight of stairs without provocation. She wept into the microphone, claiming my timber frame estate was too much for my fragile mind to handle, painting her theft as an act of familial mercy. Julian followed her to the stand. He recited a rehearsed script detailing my supposed erratic behavior over the past year. He cited his own mother's fake spinal injuries as undeniable proof of my instability. He refused to look at me while he spoke, his eyes fixed firmly on the wooden railing of the witness box. I sat at the defense table, my hands folded neatly over a blank legal pad. I did not raise a single objection. I allowed them to weave a dense, inescapable web of perjury upon the public record. Every lie spoken under oath added another layer of concrete to the prison cells they were currently digging for themselves. Judge Croft nodded along with their testimony, offering sympathetic murmurs and establishing a clear judicial bias early in the hearing. When Preston finished his performance, Croft turned a harsh glare toward my table. He instructed me to proceed with my cross-examination, his tone laced with heavy condescension. I stood, smoothing the front of my blazer, and approached the podium. The courtroom fell silent. The scratching of reporter pens echoed in the quiet space. Julian shrank back in the witness chair, his shoulders tensing. I did not waste time asking about the fictional staircase incident. You engage an enemy where they least expect the strike. Julian I began, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the room. You just testified that your primary concern is my well-being and the proper management of the Vermont estate. If your intentions are purely familial, why did you authorize a $60,000 wire transfer to a Cayman Islands trust account on the 1st of this month? The air vanished from the room. Julian lost all color in his face, his skin turning a sickly shade of ash gray. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords paralyzed. Preston vaulted out of his chair, nearly knocking his heavy leather briefcase to the floor. "Objection!" Preston shouted, pointing a frantic finger toward the podium. "The pro se defendant is harassing the witness with baseless financial conspiracies. This line of questioning has zero relevance to a conservatorship hearing." "Sustained," Judge Croft bellowed. The sharp crack of his gavel echoed off the mahogany walls. Croft leaned forward over the elevated bench, his face flushing a deep mottled red. Sweat beaded along his hairline. He recognized the exact monetary figure I had just spoken. He knew I had unearthed the pipeline funding his offshore bribes. He needed to silence me before I could articulate another syllable. "Mrs. Campbell, you will confine your questions to the medical affidavits presented today," Croft commanded, his voice trembling with suppressed panic. "I warned you about bringing your paranoid delusions into this proceeding. You will not interrogate these victims about their private corporate matters." I nodded slowly, shifting my gaze from my terrified husband to the corrupt man sitting on the bench. "Understood, Your Honor," I replied smoothly. "Let us pivot to the underlying motive for the conservatorship. Julian, is it true that Sterling Holdings is currently facing a catastrophic debt default, and you require the clean deed to my property to secure a bridge loan before a pending federal tax audit?" Preston shrieked another objection, but Croft did not even wait for the lawyer to finish. The judge slammed his gavel down repeatedly, the rapid, chaotic strikes betraying his escalating terror. His judicial facade cracked, exposing the desperate criminal hiding beneath the robes. He realized I held the keys to his destruction. To survive the morning, he needed to shatter my credibility. He needed to humiliate me in front of the press, break my spirit, and assert total, unyielding dominance over the room. Croft pushed himself up from his leather chair, leaning far over the thick wooden barrier. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my chest, targeting the bronze medal resting against my lapel. "Remove that cheap prop from your jacket," Mrs. Campbell Croft roared, the amplification system carrying his fury to every corner of the gallery. "You strut into my courtroom wearing a military costume, attempting to manipulate the press and play the hero. You are a disgrace to this county. You are an unstable, dangerous individual, and I will not allow you to use a medal of valor to hide your true, defective nature. Take it off immediately, or I will hold you in contempt and have the bailiffs drag you to a holding cell." The journalists in the gallery stopped typing. The bailiffs stood frozen near the exit doors, hands resting near their utility belts. The entire room held its collective breath, waiting for my reaction. Preston crossed his arms, offering a smug, self-satisfied grin. Beatrice adjusted her cervical collar, her eyes gleaming with wicked triumph. They believed the ultimate authority of a sitting judge would finally force my submission. They believed they had stripped away my armor. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with the sweating, furious man looming above me. My heart rate maintained a steady, relaxed rhythm. Judge Harrison Croft thought he was breaking my spirit. He had no idea. He had just handed me the exact sequence of events I required. He had just triggered the lethal, inescapable trap I had spent the last 72 hours meticulously building. "I will gladly comply with your order, Your Honor." The words leave my lips in an even, measured cadence. I keep my expression sterile, offering no hint of the impending devastation. A heavy silence settles over the packed room. The stifling heat generated by dozens of bodies presses inward. Spectators lean forward in the wooden pews, eager to witness the final subjugation of a decorated veteran. At the plaintiff table, Beatrice shifts in her chair, lifting her chin to savor the victory. Julian finally looks up from his shoes, a sneer forming on his face. Edward Preston adjusts his expensive silk tie, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. They think the weight of the judicial bench has crushed my defiance. They think stripping me of my highest honor is the final nail in my coffin. I lower my gaze to the bronze cross resting over my heart. My fingers trace the textured edges of the medal. I unfasten the clasp, drawing the sharp pin free from the dark wool of my blazer. The metal feels heavy in my palm. To the naked eye, it is a standard military decoration, a symbol of survival forged in hostile deserts, earned while dragging bleeding comrades to a medevac chopper under heavy artillery fire. But the hardware hidden within is far from standard. Prior to this hearing, during my brief encrypted coordination with Special Agent Marcus Cole, the FBI Tech Division made a surgical modification. The center gemstone had been hollowed out. Nestled inside the brass casing sits a high-grade federal transmitter, wired directly to a custom zero-day override payload. I step forward, closing the distance to the wooden railing of the witness stand. Modern courtrooms rely heavily on integrated technology. The architects designed these spaces with built-in audio-visual terminals, allowing attorneys to project digital evidence onto the jury monitors. I locate the sleek silver data port embedded right into the podium surface. My movements are fluid, practiced, and blindingly fast. I flip the protective cover open with my thumb. "Hey, what are you doing?" Preston barks, his smug demeanor fracturing as he notices my hands moving away from my lapel. He takes a half step away from his table, sensing a shift in the tactical environment, but failing to comprehend the threat. His eyes dart between my hands and the judge, uncertain if he should object to my physical movements. I do not answer. I jam the base of the modified metal directly into the Court Universal Serial Bus Terminal. The connection clicks into place, forming a solid physical link between my hardware and the municipal intranet. The hijack is instantaneous. The custom malware requires zero authorization. It bypasses the county firewalls like a ghost walking through walls, hunting for the central routing hub with predatory efficiency. Below the bench, the court reporter gasps. Her fingers freeze over her stenography machine as her monitor flashes a stark, unyielding black. She taps the keys frantically, trying to reboot the software, but the federal encryption locks her out entirely. The digital ledger of the trial ceases to exist, replaced by my controlled narrative. Overhead, the ambient hum of the courtroom shifts into a low electrical whine. The vast digital projector mounted directly behind Judge Harrison Croft whirs to life. The internal bulb ignites, bathing the mahogany paneling in a harsh, bright white glow. Croft turns his head, squinting against the sudden, blinding illumination. Panic flashes across his features. He reaches for his control switch, stabbing the override button with a thick finger. The console remains dead. My payload has severed his administrative control, rendering him a helpless spectator in his own domain. Then the integrated surround sound speakers roar to life. The audio file I extracted from Preston's hacked servers does not begin with static. It starts with the undeniable, crystal-clear resonance of a phone ringing, followed by the distinctive, arrogant baritone of the man sitting on the bench. "Let us skip the pleasantries, Edward," the recorded voice of Judge Croft booms through the speakers, echoing off the high ceilings and vibrating through the floorboards. The audio quality is pristine, capturing every inflection of his impatience and greed. "I reviewed the psychiatric affidavits you forwarded. They are sloppy, but they will suffice for a bench ruling." Preston's voice answers on the recording, sounding obsequious and nervous. "Beatrice is anxious, Harrison. The federal auditors are circling her holdings. We need the conservatorship finalized by tomorrow, or the pension fraud is going to blow up in all our faces. She needs the deed to that Vermont property to secure the bridge loan." The gallery erupts in a tidal wave of frantic whispers. Reporters scramble, lifting their recording devices toward the ceiling, capturing every syllable of the illicit exchange. The narrative they arrived to cover just evaporated, replaced by the scoop of a lifetime. Beatrice recoils as if struck physically. Her pristine, victimized facade crumbles into a mask of raw terror. She claws at the fake cervical collar around her neck, struggling to breathe as her darkest secrets broadcast to the press. The carefully constructed high society illusion shatters, exposing the desperate embezzler underneath. "I will grant the emergency order," Croft's recorded voice continues cutting through the rising noise of the spectators. "But my fee has increased. The risk is elevating. Tell Beatrice the offshore transfer to the Cayman Trust needs to reflect $80,000 this month, not the usual $60,000. "We can arrange that," Preston replies on the tape, his voice tight with anxiety. "Just make sure the veteran is locked away. We need her institutionalized and discredited. If she speaks to the feds, we are ruined." "I will strip her autonomy before lunch," Croft assures him on the playback, letting out a dark, mocking laugh that chills the room. "By the time I am finished dismantling her character on the public record, no one will believe a word she says. Just make sure the Cayman wire clears by midnight." The recording halts, leaving a ringing, electrified silence in its wake. The trap has sprung with lethal perfection. Croft stands frozen at the elevated bench. His skin morphs into a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw hangs slack. The tyrannical authority he wielded just moments ago evaporates, replaced by the crushing realization that his entire career, his freedom, and his legacy have just been incinerated in broad daylight. He stares at the gallery, watching dozens of camera lenses pointed directly at his horrified face. Julian sinks into his chair, pulling his head down into his shoulders like a frightened turtle. He covers his face with his hands, his breath coming in shallow, panic gasps. He realizes his mother's empire is collapsing, taking him down into the wreckage. Preston grips the edge of his table, his knuckles turning white. The high-priced attorney stares at the exit doors, rapidly calculating his chances of fleeing the building. He knows he just became the prime target of a federal extortion investigation, his license to practice law burning up alongside his freedom. I stand tall at the podium, surveying the devastation. I do not smile, I do not gloat. The execution of a tactical strike requires unwavering discipline until the target is fully neutralized. The audio revelation paralyzed them, stripping away their defenses and exposing their crimes to the world. But the sensory assault is far from over. Auditory proof establishes the conspiracy, but visualizing the financial rot will secure their prison sentences. The projector screen behind the judge flickers, preparing to deploy the next phase of the payload. The digital ledgers are about to expose every stolen dollar, and Julian's hidden betrayals are about to step into the light. The trap is closed, and the final strike is imminent. Judge Harrison Croft lunged beneath his elevated desk. His breathing grew shallow, ragged, echoing faintly through the live microphone he had forgotten to mute. His fingers clawed at the polished wood, desperately seeking the recessed panic button wired directly to the county sheriff dispatch. He intended to flood the room with armed guards, clear the gallery, and silence the digital execution taking place in his domain. He was a fraction of a second too late. Before his trembling hand could depress the silent alarm, the visual payload executed. The courtroom monitors, previously locked in a static black screen, flickered in rapid succession. The digital projector mounted behind the judicial bench shifted from the pulsing audio waveform to a series of stark, high-resolution financial documents. The harsh white light bathed Croft in a sterile, unforgiving glow. The mahogany paneling behind him transformed into a towering billboard of his own corruption. I stood at the podium, adjusting the microphone to ensure my voice carried over the rising clamor of the press. I did not raise my pitch. I maintained the even, measured cadence of a briefing officer detailing a neutralized target. Let the record reflect the documents currently displayed on the courtroom screens, I announced, lifting my hand to point at the towering projection. The gallery fell silent, the scratching of pens and the rapid clicking of camera shutters, the only sounds left in the cavernous space. What you are looking at are the encrypted, offshore banking ledgers from a private wealth management firm located in the Cayman Islands, I explained, guiding their eyes to the color-coded rows of data. The green columns represent incoming wire transfers. The red columns denote the originating accounts. Edward Preston shrank into his expensive tailored suit. He lowered his head, shielding his face with a legal pad, attempting to render himself invisible to the dozens of journalists documenting the scene. For the past 3 years, I continued my gaze sweeping across the stunned spectators. The plaintiff has presented herself as a pillar of New England society. She runs a boutique public relations firm. She hosts charity galas. In reality, she operates a sophisticated embezzlement syndicate. The funds you see flowing into these offshore accounts do not originate from legitimate marketing contracts. I tapped a command onto the data terminal embedded in the podium. The screen zoomed in, magnifying a specific series of routing numbers. These transfers are composed of stolen capital siphoned directly from a regional laborers' union pension fund, I stated, letting the weight of the theft settle over the room. Beatrice Sterling bled the retirement savings of blue-collar workers to finance her vintage pearls, her leased luxury vehicles, and her monthly payments to a sitting county judge. The murmurs in the gallery swelled into a wave of vocal disgust. Stealing from the wealthy was a crime. Bleeding the pensions of working-class citizens was a betrayal that ignited visceral public outrage. Beatrice clamped her hands over her ears, her pristine facade crumbling into a portrait of raw, unfiltered panic. She shook her head, denying the 10-foot letters displaying her guilt, but the evidence remained irrefutable. Yet Beatrice is not the architect of this specific financial ruin, I said, shifting my focus to the man cowering behind her chair. Julian froze. The calculated posture of the grieving, devoted son evaporated. He stared at me, his eyes wide, sensing the crosshairs locking onto his chest. For years, Julian Sterling projected the image of a successful corporate consultant. Behind closed doors, his reality consisted of leveraged debt and catastrophic failures. He engaged in high-risk, unregulated cryptocurrency trading, hemorrhaging millions of dollars in a desperate bid to outpace his own incompetence. When the margin calls arrived, he needed a liquidity source. I hit another keystroke. The projector transitioned, displaying a complex web of internal corporate authorizations, digital signatures, and encrypted email threads. Let the record show, I declared the amplification system, projecting my words like physical blows, that Julian Sterling did not just blindly sign these shell company accounts. He was the sole orchestrator of the embezzlement. He engineered the routing protocols. He utilized his mother's public relations firm as a proxy, deliberately funneling the stolen union pensions through her ledgers. He set Beatrice up to take the inevitable federal fall, shielding his own crypto losses behind her corporate liability. A sharp, ragged gasp echoed from the plaintiff table. Beatrice turned slowly, her neck rigid within the fake cervical collar. Her eyes widened, processing the magnitude of the betrayal. She stared at her golden boy, the son she had coddled, the man she was currently attempting to steal a $2 million estate for. "You," she whispered, her voice cracking, carrying over the ambient noise of the room, "you forged my authorization." Julian shrank back, pressing his spine against the wooden railing separating them from the gallery. He held his hands up, shaking his head in a pathetic display of cowardice. He could not formulate a lie fast enough to counter the immutable digital footprints glowing on the wall. He had intended to let his mother go to a federal penitentiary to save his own skin, planning to walk away clean with my Vermont estate as his prize. The mother and son dynamics shattered in real time. The unbreakable bond of old money arrogance dissolved into a venomous, self-serving panic. Beatrice lunged toward him, her manicured hands curling into claws, but her attorney physically intervened, shoving his chair between them to prevent a public brawl. The financial devastation secured their prison sentences, but the legal theater they orchestrated to steal my home required a final, decisive execution. I needed to dismantle the core lie that brought us into this courtroom. I engaged the terminal one last time. The Cayman ledgers and cryptocurrency traces vanished from the screens. In their place, a crisp black and white medical document materialized, stamped with the official seal of the County Emergency Medical Services. "Your Honor," I said, turning my attention back to the pale, trembling judge on the bench, "the plaintiff filed a sworn affidavit and broadcast a televised interview claiming I pushed her down a flight of stairs, causing severe spinal trauma. This hearing was convened based on that assertion of instability." I pointed to the digital projector. The medical report now displayed was pulled directly from the municipal dispatch server 20 minutes after her supposed assault. I stated my tone sharp and clinical. The attending paramedic explicitly noted that her injuries were superficial. Oxygen saturation was optimal, blood pressure was normal, there was zero physiological evidence of spinal trauma. I zoomed in on the paramedic narrative notes, the text filling the screen. Furthermore, the emergency responder documented dark purple discoloration on the neck. Upon applying a saline flush, the discoloration dissolved. The texture and residue were verified as synthetic theatrical cosmetics. She painted fake bruises on her skin to sell a performance to the authorities. Beatrice reached up her fingers trembling as she touched the edge of her rigid neck brace. The prop that had garnered her so much public sympathy just hours ago now served as a glaring symbol of her perjury. She faked the injury, I declared, ensuring every journalist in the room absorbed the truth. She filed a false police report, committed perjury under oath, and conspired to defraud the judicial system to steal my property. The silence in the courtroom possessed a heavy, suffocating quality. The meticulous narrative of the victimized New England family was obliterated. The reporters lowered their cameras, staring at the plaintiffs with overt contempt. The illusion was dead. The sterling legacy built on decades of projected superiority lay in ruins on the polished hardwood floor. Julian slid down into his chair, burying his face in his hands, weeping softly. Beatrice stared blankly at the mahogany table, her chest heaving, stripped of her wealth, her son, and her freedom. Judge Croft remained slumped over his bench, a defeated tyrant, waiting for the inevitable consequences of his greed. The tactical payload had deployed flawlessly. The psychological and digital warfare was complete. Now it was time for the physical extraction. I stepped back from the podium, waiting for the heavy oak doors at the back of the room to open. The trap had closed, and the hunters were about to arrive. Judge Harrison Croft recoiled, stumbling backward until his spine collided with the heavy wooden paneling of his elevated bench. His breath hitched in ragged, desperate gasps. The undeniable proof of his offshore extortion illuminated the room, burning his guilt into the retinas of every journalist present. He thrust a trembling finger toward the witness stand, seeking a scapegoat for his impending ruin. "Arrest her!" Croft shrieked, his voice fracturing under the strain of raw terror. The sound echoed through the microphone, still broadcasting his downfall. "Bailiffs, seize that woman right now. She is hacking a municipal network. Throw her in a holding cell." 2 county deputies stationed near the gallery exits shifted their weight, their hands resting uncertainly near their duty belts. They looked up at the towering projection displaying the Cayman Island ledgers. They looked down at the disgraced man demanding their obedience. Then they locked eyes with each other. These were local law enforcement officers who swore an oath to uphold the law, and the man issuing the commands had just been exposed as a prominent architect of a regional embezzlement syndicate. Neither deputy took a single step forward. Their boots remained firmly planted on the polished hardwood. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in. They refused to sacrifice their own badges, their pensions, or their freedom to protect a compromised courtroom. The localized judicial shield Beatrice relied upon shattered in an instant. Croft looked at his immobilized guards, realizing his authority had evaporated, leaving him entirely exposed to the consequences of his greed. Before Croft could issue another frantic directive, the heavy oak doors at the rear of the gallery burst inward. The heavy wood slammed against the plaster walls with a deafening crash, shaking the foundational beams of the historic building. A shockwave of structured chaos flooded the room. Special Agent Marcus Cole strode down the center aisle, moving with the lethal, unyielding precision of a former Army Ranger entering a hostile theater. He did not wear a suit today. He wore full tactical gear, a Kevlar vest bearing the stark yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation across his chest. Flanking him were a dozen armed federal agents, their boots hitting the floor in synchronized, echoing thuds. The tactical team operated with terrifying efficiency, a well-oiled machine executing a meticulous takedown sequence. The spectators scrambled backward, pressing themselves into the wooden pews to clear a path. The local deputies immediately raised their hands, stepping aside to grant the federal task force unrestricted access. Marcus bypassed the witness stand entirely, offering me a single, silent nod of acknowledgement. The intelligence had been gathered and delivered. The execution phase belonged solely to him. The strike force divided, moving with fluid purpose. Marcus and 3 agents surged toward the elevated bench, ascending the wooden steps in a blur of dark tactical fabric. Croft scrambled backward, holding his hands up in a pathetic attempt to ward off the inevitable. "You possess no jurisdiction here," Croft stammered, his voice a reedy, desperate whisper. "I am a sitting magistrate. I demand you stand down." Marcus did not slow his pace. He breached the bench, seizing Croft by the collar of his black judicial robes. The agent spun the disgraced official around, driving him chest first into the polished surface of his own mahogany desk. The impact rattled the glass water pitcher and sent legal pads scattering across the floor. "Harrison Croft, you are under arrest for federal extortion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to launder illicit funds," Marcus stated, his deep baritone cutting through the din of the courtroom like a physical blow. 2 agents grasped the heavy fabric of the judicial robes, ripping the garment from his shoulders. The symbolic stripping of his power laid him bare, reducing him to a sweating, trembling criminal in a rumpled dress shirt. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tight echoed over the live microphone still resting near my podium. Marcus leaned in close, reciting the Miranda rights with cold, methodical detachment, ensuring every syllable was documented for the upcoming prosecution. Simultaneously, the second contingent of federal agents converged on the plaintiff table. Edward Preston, the high-priced attorney who had attempted to lock me in a psychiatric ward just 24 hours prior, threw his hands into the air and backed slowly against the wall. He abandoned his clients without hesitation, eager to separate himself from the radioactive fallout of their crimes, terrified his own license to practice law was about to evaporate. Beatrice Sterling sat paralyzed in her chair. The pristine, elegant facade of the New England matriarch fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. As a female agent gripped her wrist, hauling her to her feet, Beatrice unleashed a shrill, breathless scream. The theatrical poise vanished, replaced by hysterical panic. She thrashed her arms, clawing at the rigid cervical collar around her neck, ripping the fake medical prop away as she struggled against the restraint. "Take your hands off me!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. Her expensive cosmetics smeared down her cheeks, ruining her curated image. "I am a respected business owner. You cannot do this to me. Julian, tell them to stop. Tell them this is a mistake." The agent applied a swift joint lock, forcing Beatrice to bend forward over the mahogany table. The steel cuffs snapped around her delicate wrists, pinning her arms securely behind her back. The illusion of generational wealth and untouchable influence burned to ash in front of the entire gallery, leaving only a desperate embezzler facing a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary. Beside her, Julian did not offer a single word of defense. A pair of agents pinned him against the wooden railing. He went entirely limp, weeping openly as the cold metal locked around his wrists. The custom Italian suit he wore now looked like a cheap costume on a broken man. He realized the digital footprint of his cryptocurrency losses and his authorization of the stolen union pensions had sealed his fate. His cowardly double-cross had backfired, trapping him in the very cage he had helped construct to imprison his own wife. The local media, originally assembled to document the tragic downfall of a decorated combat veteran, recognized the monumental shift in the narrative. They pivoted their camera lenses away from the witness stand, focusing their high-definition recording equipment entirely on the crumbling syndicate. Flashes illuminated the courtroom in rapid succession, capturing Beatrice screaming in handcuffs and Judge Croft, stripped of his robes, hauled away like a common thief. The journalists documented the total annihilation of the town's most prominent elite circle. Every network in the state would broadcast their humiliation by noon. I remained standing at the podium, a silent architect overseeing the destruction of the predators who sought to steal my sanctuary. The tactical strike was flawless, yet one final layer of retribution remained to be executed before I could walk out of the courthouse untouched. The physical arrests secured their prison sentences, but the psychological destruction of Julian Sterling required one final, devastating revelation. The federal agents gripped Beatrice by her arms, hoisting her toward the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom. She thrashed against their hold, her designer heels dragging across the polished hardwood floor. The pristine facade of the New England matriarch had shattered into jagged, unrecognizable fragments. She shrieked, demanding to speak with her lawyer, demanding to contact the governor, but her cries were swallowed by the cacophony of camera shutters and overlapping shouts from the press gallery. The journalists documented every second of her humiliating exit, eager to broadcast the ruin of a woman who had spent decades dictating local high society through intimidation and unearned wealth. Edward Preston, her high-priced attorney, had already slipped out a side exit, abandoning his client to save his own license to practice law. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind Beatrice, sealing her fate, the localized chaos shifted focus. Julian remained pinned against the wooden railing of the plaintiff table. Two agents released their grip on his shoulders, stepping back to secure the perimeter of the room. They did not need to physically restrain him anymore. The spineless golden boy lacked the fortitude to run or fight. His knees buckled under the weight of his reality. He slid down the polished wood barrier, collapsing onto the floor in a crumpled heap. The custom Italian suit he wore wrinkled beneath him, mirroring the collapse of his entire existence. He sat amidst the scattered legal pads and overturned chairs, gasping for air as if the room had suddenly run out of oxygen. The realization of his circumstances crashed down upon him in punishing waves. The federal government was currently seizing his bank accounts, auditing his holding companies, and liquidating his assets. He stood legally liable for federal corporate fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. He had spent his life hiding behind his mother's wealth, and now that shield was gone, replaced by a looming decade in a federal penitentiary. He looked up from the floor, his eyes darting wildly around the room. He saw the corrupt judge Harrison Croft being escorted out in handcuffs by a separate tactical team. He saw the empty chairs where his invincible mother had sat just moments prior. Then his frantic gaze locked onto me. I still stood at the witness podium, watching the tactical sweep conclude with detached precision. Julian scrambled onto his hands and knees. He crawled across the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes scuffing the hardwood. He ignored the journalists watching him. He abandoned his dignity. He reached the base of the witness stand, gripping the wooden edge with trembling fingers, looking up at me, with a face slick with sweat and tears. "Natalia, please!" he choked out, his voice cracking into a high, reedy sob that echoed in the cavernous space. "Please, you have to tell them. Tell that federal agent you know me. Tell him I had no choice in this scheme." I stared down at the groveling man. He wiped his nose on the sleeve of his expensive jacket, his chest heaving. The man I had married 3 years ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cornered rat seeking a dark place to hide. "My mother forced me to sign those ledger authorizations," Julian pleaded, pointing a shaking finger toward the doors where Beatrice had just vanished. She manipulated everything behind the scenes. I was terrified of her influence. She threatened to cut me off, to leave me with nothing if I did not cooperate with the union pension theft. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to take your house. You know I love you. We are married. You have federal connections. You can talk to Marcus Cole. You can secure me an immunity deal. Please, Natalia, save me." He wept openly, clutching the hem of my tailored navy suit jacket. He was attempting to deploy the exact same manipulative tactics he had used for years. He wanted me to clean up his mess. He wanted me to shield him from the consequences of his own greed. He believed that invoking our marriage would trigger a biological response to protect him. I looked at the man trembling at my feet, searching my own chest for a single shred of empathy. I found nothing but cold, sterile indifference. He had watched his mother hand me a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation on Christmas Eve. He had broken into my sanctuary, swinging a heavy iron fireplace poker at my head to steal my digital security token. He had sat in this very courtroom 20 minutes ago, committing perjury to lock me in a state hospital indefinitely. He was a parasite, and his host had just been eradicated. I reached down, peeling his sweaty fingers off my wool blazer. I stepped back, ensuring a clinical distance between us. "You are a coward, Julian," I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the sudden quiet of the emptying courtroom. "You were not terrified of your mother. You were terrified of losing your luxury vehicles and your leased penthouse. You orchestrated the theft of those union pensions to cover your own cryptocurrency failures, and you set Beatrice up to take the fall. You sold your own flesh and blood to save your skin." Julian gasped, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. He shook his head frantically, trying to deny the truth I had already broadcasted to the entire room via the projector screen. "I had no alternative," he whimpered. "She was going to ruin me." I turned toward the defense table, retrieving my minimalist briefcase. I unsnapped the leather clasp and reached inside. I had brought physical hard copies of the most damaging digital evidence, knowing that technology is merely a delivery system. The tactile weight of paper carries a finality that pixels cannot match. I pulled a thin blue legal folder from the compartment. "You think you outsmarted her?" I said, turning back to face him. "You think your double cross was a brilliant tactical maneuver? But you forgot that predators do not share their meals." I tossed the blue folder onto the floor. It landed with a soft slap, sliding across the polished wood until it bumped against Julian's knees. He stared at it as if it were an explosive device, too terrified to reach out and open the cover. "Read it," I instructed, my tone offering zero room for negotiation. Julian reached forward with trembling hands. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the bold black text on the first page. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The legal jargon outlined a precise, targeted assassination of his financial future. "I will summarize the contents for you," I offered, projecting my voice so the remaining federal agents in the room could hear the conclusion of this domestic warfare. While I was inside Edward Preston's legal network last night, I did not just find the extortion emails between your mother and the judge. I found the private correspondence between Beatrice and her attorney. She instructed Preston to draft those exact documents you are holding. They are finalized divorce papers, Julian. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, with a crushing, suffocating realization. "She planned to file them the exact moment Judge Croft granted the conservatorship and transferred my estate to the Sterling Family Trust," I explained, delivering the final lethal strike to his psyche. "Beatrice knew about your cryptocurrency debts. She knew about your phantom ledgers. Her plan was to secure my $2 million property, cut you out of the family trust entirely, and leave you holding the bag for the cartel debt. The clauses in that document strip you of all alimony and assign you full liability for the shell companies. She was planning to abandon you to the federal authorities while she retired on my land." Julian dropped the folder. The papers spilled across the floor, displaying the meticulous legal framework designed to ruin him. The mutual betrayal was laid bare in the bright fluorescent light. He had spent the last year meticulously framing his mother for his own financial crimes, unaware that his mother had hired a high-priced lawyer to discard him the second he outlived his usefulness. They were two scorpions in a jar, stinging each other to death, while I simply removed the lid and watched. "She was gonna leave me," Julian whispered, his voice hollow, stripped of all humanity. My own mother was going to leave me to drown. He curled in on himself, pressing his forehead against the hardwood floor. His weeping devolved into a pathetic, broken keen. The golden boy was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man who realized he had betrayed the only person who ever truly protected him, all for a family that viewed him as disposable collateral. I did not offer him a comforting hand. I did not utter a single word of forgiveness. Toxic environments demand permanent severance, not prolonged negotiations. I secured the clasps on my briefcase, turned my back on his sobbing form, and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The few remaining journalists parted to let me pass, offering silent, awestruck reverence to a woman who had just dismantled a corrupt syndicate with surgical precision. I pushed through the heavy oak doors, leaving the wreckage of my marriage behind me forever. I stepped out into the crisp, biting Vermont air, inhaling the cold wind. I was untouched, unbroken, and entirely free. 6 months passed, clearing the winter frost from the Vermont mountains and replacing it with the sharp, crisp air of early summer. I stood in the kitchen of my timber frame estate, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. The aroma of dark roast mingled with the faint metallic scent of heated copper wiring emanating from the newly installed server racks down the hall. I stared at the flat-screen monitor mounted above the granite island. The local morning news anchored the broadcast with a familiar headline. The federal sentencing phase of the regional corruption syndicate had officially concluded. The anchor maintained a grave, practiced tone as the mugshots filled the display. Harrison Croft appeared first. The disgraced former judge wore a standard-issue khaki uniform, his arrogant sneer replaced by the hollow, sunken stare of a ruined man. The judge handed him a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. His pension, his legacy, and his untouchable status were eradicated. Beatrice Sterling flashed onto the screen next. The opulent New England matriarch was gone. Her hair hung flat, stripped of its expensive styling. Her booking photo captured a woman who had aged a decade in 6 months. She received a 15-year sentence for her extensive embezzlement ring, her high society reputation permanently reduced to a cautionary tale. Finally, the broadcast displayed Julian. My former husband looked at the camera with wide, terrified eyes. The anchor detailed his 10-year sentence for corporate fraud. Julian sat in a federal cell entirely bankrupt, friendless, and abandoned by the very mother he had attempted to frame. The golden boy had traded his sanctuary for a concrete cage. I pressed the remote, turning the screen black. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. Justice does not require a parade. It simply requires a reset of the tactical board. I set my coffee mug on the counter and walked out of the kitchen, stepping into the grand foyer of my property. The $2.5 million estate was no longer just a secluded fortress where I hid from the echoes of past deployments. I had utilized the offshore security bounties I earned to transform the sprawling structure into a state-of-the-art training facility. The heavy timber beams and reclaimed wood floors now housed an elite cybersecurity and tactical defense academy designed specifically for female veterans transitioning out of military service. I walked down the main corridor, feeling the steady, rhythmic vibration of high-capacity cooling units pulsing through the floorboards. The expansive formal dining room, the exact location where Beatrice had dropped that fraudulent psychiatric evaluation onto my plate on Christmas Eve, buzzed with focused, relentless energy. Rows of dual-monitor workstations replaced the antique lace tablecloth. A dozen women, former intelligence analysts, combat medics, and logistics specialists, sat at the terminals. They were learning to dismantle corporate firewalls, hunt digital predators, and secure critical infrastructure. I was equipping them with the exact tools I used to obliterate a corrupt syndicate, ensuring they would never find themselves defenseless in a civilian world that often forgot their sacrifices. A young woman named Sarah, a former Marine communications operator who had struggled to find her footing after her discharge, raised her hand. I stepped behind her ergonomic chair, analyzing the cascade of code scrolling across her display. I located the backdoor vulnerability in the simulated banking gateway, Sarah said, her voice steady and confident. They masked the routing protocol behind a phantom shell company, just like the training module outlined. If I execute the override script now, I can lock them out of the administrative controls. I placed a hand on her shoulder, nodding. Perfect execution, Sarah. Never trust the perimeter defense. Always look for the loose thread in their internal ledgers. Run the override and secure the network. She typed the command, her posture rigid with newfound purpose. I watched her screen flash a bright green confirmation block. She had neutralized the threat. I stepped away, walking toward the large bay windows overlooking the 50 acres of dense green forest surrounding the property. These women arrived here carrying the invisible weight of their service. In this sanctuary, they learned to forge that weight into a weapon. They were building their own armor. The crunch of gravel drifting from the long driveway pulled my attention away from the training floor. I looked through the reinforced glass, spotting a dark, unmarked SUV navigating the winding path toward the main entrance. The vehicle parked near the stone steps. The driver's side door opened, and Special Agent Marcus Cole stepped out into the mountain air. He wore a tailored charcoal suit instead of the heavy tactical gear he donned during the courthouse raid. He scanned the perimeter, his eyes lingering on the newly upgraded biometric security gates and the discreet surveillance cameras mounted along the roofline. He walked up the steps, and I met him in the foyer, pulling the heavy oak door open before he could knock. "Morning," Natalia, Marcus said, offering a rare, genuine nod of respect. "The facility looks formidable. You turned a quiet cabin into a fortress." I gestured for him to enter, leading him away from the bustling training rooms and into my private study. "It serves a purpose," I replied, taking my seat behind the mahogany desk. "The women here need a place to recalibrate. I am just providing the hardware and the battlefield strategy." Marcus sat in the leather guest chair across from me. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a small, pristine velvet presentation box. He placed it carefully on the center of my desk, pushing it forward with his index finger. "The technicians at the Bureau finished processing the evidence," Marcus explained, his tone shifting to a quiet professional cadence. "The audio files you hijacked during the conservatorship hearing sealed the indictments. The prosecution did not even need to offer plea deals. The syndicate collapsed under the weight of its own digital footprint. The director wanted me to return this to you personally." I looked at the black velvet. I reached forward, lifting the lid. Resting inside, on a bed of dark satin, was my Distinguished Service Cross. The bronze metal gleamed polished and pristine. The federal technicians had removed the high-grade transmitter from the center gemstone, restoring the decoration to its original, unmodified state. It was no longer a piece of surveillance equipment used to snare a corrupt judge. It was a symbol of honor, discipline, and survival. My former in-laws had attempted to use this very metal as a weapon against me. They tried to paint my service as a mental defect. They ordered me to strip it from my chest to assert their dominance. They failed, and their failure cost them everything they valued. I picked up the metal, feeling the familiar grounding weight in the palm of my hand. I stood up from my chair, squaring my shoulders. With deliberate precision, I pinned the bronze cross to the lapel of my navy blazer, securing the clasp tightly against the fabric. I looked up, meeting Marcus Cole's eyes. We shared a silent understanding, the unspoken bond of two operatives who knew the cost of waging war and the quiet peace that follows a decisive victory. Marcus stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "You did good work here, Natalia. The Bureau has a few freelance consulting contracts coming down the pipeline. Complex financial tracing. I told them you were the best in the sector. I will send the encrypted files over by the end of the week." "I appreciate the referral, Marcus. Send the data. My team will be ready for the challenge." He turned and walked out of the study, leaving me alone in the quiet center of my domain. I stepped toward the large window, looking out over the sprawling estate. The morning sun cast long golden shadows across the vibrant green lawn. The sound of keystrokes and low, focused conversations drifted down the hallway from the training rooms. I had defended my home, protected my assets, and dismantled a toxic threat from the inside out. I weaponized the very skills my enemies underestimated to build an unbreakable empire. Society conditions people to endure suffering under the guise of familial loyalty. They expect you to absorb the disrespect, to weather the emotional manipulation, and to forgive the unforgivable simply because of shared genetics or a marriage certificate. But loyalty demands reciprocity. Blood does not grant anyone the right to abuse you. A marriage license is not a free pass for exploitation. When predators sit at your dining table and demand you surrender your peace, you do not owe them compliance. You owe yourself protection. Severing ties with toxic family members is never a failure. It is not an act of surrender. It is a tactical retreat to higher ground. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation.